Man, I really don't know what's happened to the Russo brothers. They went from directing genuinely funny episodes of Community and Arrested Development to actually making some of the best movies from the MCU. But now, all the movies they've directed outside of Marvel have just been kind of awful really. Cherry was their first attempt at creating a more dramatic film, and it was pretty bad. And The Gray Man was an insanely generic and boring spy movie, with bland directing and uninspired action scenes mixed with their usual style of MCU comedy, filled with overly quippy characters and badly placed jokes that undercut any serious moment and take you right out of the story. Netflix gave them a $200 million budget to make a mediocre movie that had a very weak reception. So of course, in response to this, Netflix gave the Russo brothers $320 million to make another one. Jesus Christ, The Electric State is awful. It's a painfully boring road trip story set in a generic dystopian sci-fi world that doesn't make its audience interested or curious about its lore, nor does it make you care for its shallow surface level characters. And, of course, since it's a blockbuster directed by the Russo brothers, you already know that the whole thing was enhanced by giving it an overly self-aware, quippy comedic tone just like the MCU. You know, because no one has gotten tired of that, not at all. At the same time though, The Electric State is legitimately amazing, one of the most creative and well-written pieces of modern science fiction that crafted a really engaging personal main story set in a fascinating world that serves as a warning on how technology can completely disrupt society and change people for the worse. Both of these statements are true because The Electric State actually originated as an illustrated novel made by Swedish artist Simon Stålenhag back in 2018, and it's absolutely fantastic. Stålenhag wrote and drew one of the most fascinating sci-fi stories of modern times, and by looking at the book and comparing it to its lackluster adaptation, we can see clear, untapped potential and what could have honestly been one of the greatest sci-fi movies ever had it been properly adapted. This is what personally frustrated me the most about this new movie. Since the worst kind of movie, in my opinion, isn't just boring or incompetently made, the worst kind of movie is one that wastes a great idea through poor execution, since knowing that a story is ruining what could be an interesting concept or idea makes you irritated the entire time you're watching it, which is exactly what happened to me when I was watching The Electric State. The entire time I just couldn't stop thinking about how infinitely better the book was. The Electric State is essentially a story about a young teenage girl named Michelle and her small robot companion Skip, traveling across the US for unclear motives at first, but they need to reach the West Coast in a US that's been completely ravaged by war and is on the brink of societal collapse. Set in an alternate reality 1997 where technology has advanced to a point where it's invaded all aspects of life, it immediately places us in a dark, foreboding world that instantly sparks curiosity and makes us want to know what happened and how things got to this point. It's slowly revealed that Michelle is traveling across the US in order to find her lost younger brother, who was taken away by social services after their mother died years prior, with Michelle being sent to her grandfather until he died as well, and she went through several foster homes afterwards. It's also revealed to us that the reason why the US became so advanced in this timeline is because back in the 1960s, the military discovered a means of transferring data between a human brain and a machine without much latency, giving way to the unhinged connection between man and technology. This progressed to the point that by the 1980s, the US military was able to have human pilots remotely controlling drones for warfare, and Michelle's mother was actually a drone pilot. This technological advancement came at the cost of huge amounts of human lives, and also the sacrifice of their very own pilots, since those military officers that controlled the drones were the first in society to start developing a physical and psychological dependency on the technology, with a lot of pilots dying or turning into addicts if they survived. And the bizarre thing was that after the war, all surviving pilots who participated in the project ended up with infertility, and they were no longer able to have children because of this. After the war, a company called Center repurposed this technology developed by the military and adapted it for civilian use, with them commercially releasing a line of virtual reality headsets called Neurocasters that allowed people to also remotely control machines, while their consciousness escaped into a virtual matrix that made them experience whatever type of stimulation they wanted. People became far too accustomed to using them, however, and as the Neurocasters were updated, they also became increasingly addictive for its users, with many people entering a sort of vegetative state after prolonged use, as they stopped caring for themselves physically, and their minds became completely connected to the Neurocasters, leading to them losing any kind of agency and individuality they once might have had. All of this also led to a possible hive mind being created by the linking of all these human brains, with people calling it the intercerebral intelligence. Some believed it was just a conspiracy, but many others were convinced that the neurocasters led to a collective machine hive mind, which they theorized was trying to create a physical form during the war. The main story itself picks up after Center released a huge software update in 1996, which made the neurocasters more intense and caused even more people to become completely absorbed by it, and left most of the US as a desolate dystopian hellscape, with hundreds of abandoned towns consumed by technology and thousands of people dead. All of this sounds really interesting, right? This book immediately grabs your attention with its amazingly haunting visuals, and it makes you curious for the world it's presenting, as it slowly gives more details throughout the story, keeping you engaged all the way through. The movie, however, made the insanely stupid decision to give a basic, simplified explanation for the world's backstory in the very first 5 minutes of the movie. It basically treats the audience as stupid little kids who couldn't have possibly figured out any of this on their own, so they just decided to do a huge exposition dump right as the movie just started, killing any kind of curiosity the audience might have had before. But wait, it gets even worse, since literally right after this they decided to spoil the biggest twist in the entire story, and I want to give a spoiler warning here in case you don't want to know, since I genuinely believe that The Electric State is one of the greatest modern sci-fi books, and reading it blind is the best way to experience it. But if you already watched the movie, you've already been spoiled by the Russo brothers. In any case, it's only by the end of the book that it's revealed that Michelle was traveling across the US to track down her younger brother, who was still alive and was actually remotely controlling the small robot Skip, with Michelle finally finding her younger brother in a vegetative state connected to her neurocaster and his body completely debilitated. It's a really tragic, emotionally effective scene that makes you feel for these characters and turns it into one of the most memorable plot twists of recent memory. The movie though just flat out tells you that the robot is Michelle's brother, and there's no ambiguity about it at all. The movie thinks its audience is so stupid that the robot literally points at a picture of her brother. It's ridiculous. I seriously shouldn't even be explaining why this was a bad choice that objectively makes the entire story worse. This would be as if The Sixth Sense started out by straight up announcing that Bruce Willis is a ghost right in the first 2 minutes of the movie. It's insanely stupid, and I honestly can't imagine how they thought this was a good change to make. And the movie is filled with these baffling creative choices that bring the entire concept down. And what's even worse is that the movie left out one of the most interesting aspects about the twist. If you recall, earlier I said that after the war the surviving pilots were left infertile, yet Michelle's mother was still able to give birth to Christopher, with her even saying to Michelle that he didn't have a father. The book heavily implied that Christopher's real father was actually the machine hive mind itself, which is also why the book mentions that it wanted to create a physical form during the war. It succeeded and it created Christopher. This is why he's so important to the plot, and also explains how he was able to remotely control a robot while also still maintaining his own individual consciousness, something that the movie didn't even bother to explain. The movie has a lot of legitimate flaws, but this is the single biggest reason why it fails as an adaptation in my opinion. It completely threw away the sense of mystery and ambiguity of the original book. In the novel, they carefully reveal the world's lore and Michelle's backstory by making juxtapositions between the situation she got herself into and how that reminded her of how the world got to that place. It didn't flat out tell you exactly what happened. It treated its audience with respect and allowed them to put all the pieces together. For example, the book didn't explicitly state right away that society collapsed as a result of people becoming addicted to neurocasters. It gave you pieces of information about how the neurocasters affected people, and made the reader realize on their own how everything was connected. Throughout the book, as Michelle travels across the US and sees the huge machines left all over the country and people addicted to neurocasters, it makes her reminisce about her past, giving us details like how her mother was also an addict, and how they had to live in a car after she was discharged from the military. The book didn't just tell you that the neurocasters were addictive, it showed you by describing traumatic memories from Michelle's past with vivid detail, like how her foster parents also gradually became addicted. Michelle recounts how one day her foster mother fell into the pool as she was wearing a neurocaster, with her drowning for minutes until she was rescued. And although she was still alive when they took her out of the pool, she immediately died once they removed her neurocaster. This led to Michelle's foster father becoming deeply depressed, with him immersing himself even more into the neurocaster's matrix until he was left in a catatonic state, with Michelle one day discovering him being eaten alive by birds, even though his body didn't react at all, since he had been completely consumed by the machine hive mind. It's a very introspective and melancholic story that knows how to organically flesh out its background by connecting that information with whatever horrible situation our protagonists find themselves in, with small personal moments, like Michelle and Skip having to sleep in the car on a stormy night, describing the anxiety that Michelle feels as she's driving through a more densely populated city on her stolen car, thinking what would happen if the police stopped her. Or them later booking a room in an old, dilapidated motel in a small town, with run-down, humidity-ridden walls, allowing for a somber moment of tranquility that allows Michelle to reminisce as she watches a broken TV that only plays static. The Electric State knew how to advance its plot forward while also giving us relevant information in a natural way, being filled with terrifying moments. A scene like Michelle and Skip keeping quiet inside their car as they see a huge machine that's leading a line of people with neurocasters on walking like zombies isn't only a moment of horror, it's also an introspective moment that makes Michelle think about her own personal experiences with neurocasters and how they made the entire world turn to complete shit. Another great dread-inducing moment happens as they're driving on the road and see an old abandoned farmhouse where a huge intimidating smiling drone just stares at them and waves. One really big problem with the movie adaptation is the huge tonal shift, since the movie is a generic action comedy, while the book is an introspective, melancholic, dystopian sci-fi story. And this was clearly done because they wanted to simplify the book's plot and make it more widely accessible, which is just another way of saying they wanted to dumb it down, which they did. They dumbed down the book so much that its main message was completely ruined. The Electric State is essentially a story that warns us about the dangers of technology addiction and rampant consumerism, making us question our own role in the degradation of society. The movie ruined this by making the story a simple, generic conflict between man versus robots. This really goes against the book's themes, since it partly takes away the human's responsibility in being the cause of society's downfall. And given that the novel implied that the big war was between different groups of humans, not against robots, and it leaves it ambiguous as to whether it was a war between the US and a foreign nation, or if it was actually a civil war that took place in the US, with the use of drones escalating the conflict even further, something that normalized the use of machines, and made people more accepting of neurocasters afterwards. For the movie, they obviously wanted to simplify things, and ended up presenting it as a black and white conflict without any complexity or nuance. The need to make this a simple man versus robot story gave the writers the necessity to create a character that could represent the robot side as a whole, which is why they created Mr. Peanut. And I hate Mr. Peanut. I hate him so goddamn much. Another cool, unique aspect about the original book is that it was a sort of subversion of the usual story trope of a badass older man traveling with a younger person, like The Road, The Last of Us, True Grit, and many more, by having a young kid traveling with a small robot. The movie, though, ruins this by introducing Chris Pratt's character and his dumbass annoying robot, which were both original characters made for the movie. By doing this, they decided to take away from the gravity of the story in order to add comedic relief. The decision to turn this dark, depressing, and deep story into an action comedy was already bad enough, but adding two comedic relief characters for the entire movie just made it even worse. It took away from Michelle's self-reliance and made the entire story less meaningful. This is also one of the biggest reasons why this movie is bad, even if we don't compare it to the source material. I mean, forget about the book. If we look at this film and what it does on its own, it's still a really mediocre movie. It's supposed to be a comedy, but it's completely unfunny. It's supposed to be an action movie, but its action scenes are a CGI mess that lack any sort of impact. It's supposed to be an alternate reality sci-fi story, but it executed its idea so poorly that it ended up becoming yet another generic sci-fi setting based around a conflict between humans and robots without any uniqueness to it. The cast is stacked with great actors. It even has George Costanza, but none of them gave an actual good performance. Even the two main villains played by Giancarlo Esposito and Stanley Tucci were really underdeveloped, and the movie's pacing is just awful. They took a focused, narratively tight story about just a girl and a robot traveling across the country and turned it into an insanely bloated ensemble movie with multiple characters that just take away rather than add anything meaningful to the film. It doesn't maintain your interest throughout the movie. By the point they reach the mall, the story comes at a complete stop, and it meanders there for a while before the plot gets going again. It barely has any tension, since the robots completely accept Michelle and Chris Pratt as guests immediately, even though there's supposed to be a race war going on. And Mr. Peanut, fucking Mr. Peanut, goes from not wanting to help them to wanting to help them in the span of like 5 minutes. So yeah, this movie is really bad. But it's not only bad in a vacuum, since it's actually indicative of a much more concerning practice in modern-day filmmaking. A few months back, there was a really interesting essay published by N+1 and written by Will Tavlin that talked about how Netflix's subscription-based business model has made it not really care about the quality of each individual movie or show they produce, and it's changed the way in which they greenlit projects. Nowadays, it's very common for people to not pay full attention to whatever movie or show they're watching. A lot of people just put something on the TV to use as background noise as they're scrolling on their phones. And I'll admit, I'm also guilty of this from time to time. But in response to this, Netflix has started repeatedly giving notes to screenwriters for them to write scripts in such a way that people can follow along the story as it plays in the background without actually having to watch the screen. This is why Netflix movies and a lot of modern shows and films in general just seem to be really dumbed down. It's why dialogue seems so stilted and obvious, and it's also why complex original stories get simplified into something more easily consumable. It's another reason why I hate this movie so much. The Electric State originally was an anti-consumerist story, and it was turned into yet another soulless corporate product for people to consume. It was originally a story that warns us about the dangers of using technology unethically, and it was turned into a movie that actually used AI in its production. Oh yeah, I'm not joking. Joe Russo recently came out confirming that they actually used AI for some voice modulation in the movie, defending its usage and saying that it benefits creativity. He literally said that generative AI, a technology built upon stolen data that's already stealing jobs from creative people, is actually good for creativity. This is disgusting. Absolutely disgusting. And it's kind of ironic that a dystopian movie used a technology that could very well lead to our own real-life dystopia, which we might as well be living in already. It's just a shame to know the amazing potential that the Electric State has, and how it was completely wasted by people who just don't care about what they're making. It could have been one of the best modern sci-fi movies, mixed with horror and a sense of haunting melancholy. But no, they turned a profound work of art into a generic product. Instead of wasting $320 million in making yet another bland action comedy, they easily could have spent less than half of that to create a sci-fi horror film that was faithful to the source material. But I guess that's too much to ask for. And I guess that movies will continue getting increasingly more expensive and less creative if things keep up like this. But oh well, I just hope Simon Stålenhag got a nice bag from those $320 million. At least he actually deserves it. Even though his work deserved a much better adaptation than fucking goddamn Mr. Peanut. Jesus Christ.